In the year 1805, New York was not yet the towering metropolis we recognize today. It was a city contained within the lower tip of Manhattan Island, a place where church steeples rose above wooden rooftops and the streets ended abruptly at farmland. The population had recently surpassed 75,000 people, making it the largest city in the young American Republic, but its physical boundaries remained modest. Most residents lived below what is now Canal Street, and beyond that line lay open fields, marshes, and scattered country estates. This was New York in transition, no longer a colonial outpost but not yet an industrial giant, caught between its maritime past and an uncertain future. The city's importance stemmed from its natural harbor. The confluence of the Hudson and East Rivers created a protected anchorage that had attracted Dutch settlers nearly 2 centuries earlier, and by 1805, this geographic advantage had transformed New York into the busiest port on the eastern seaboard. Ships arrived daily from Liverpool, Havana, Canton, and dozens of other ports, their holds packed with goods that would be distributed across the interior of the continent. The waterfront dictated the rhythm of city life. Fortunes were made and lost based on cargo manifests, and the smell of tar, salt water, and imported spices permeated the narrow streets that climbed upward from the docks. What strikes the modern observer most forcefully is how intimate this city was, how every resident could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour. There were no anonymous crowds, no vast districts where strangers passed without recognition. Reputation mattered in ways difficult to comprehend today. A merchant's word was his currency, and a family's standing could be destroyed by a single scandal. People lived their entire lives within a few blocks, conducting business with the same faces, worshiping in the same churches, and settling disputes through networks of personal connection rather than impersonal bureaucracy. The streets themselves were narrow and irregular, following paths that had been established decades earlier without any coordinated plan. Broadway was the widest and most fashionable thoroughfare, running north from the Battery through the heart of the commercial district. Along its length stood the finest homes, built of brick rather than wood, with glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun. These houses belonged to the merchant elite, families whose names appeared on shipping manifests and bank ledgers, people who had invested in the city's growth and profited handsomely from it. Their doorways opened directly onto the street, and their parlors faced the constant traffic of pedestrians, horses, and the occasional private carriage. Below Broadway, closer to the waterfront, the streets became denser and more chaotic. Pearl Street and Water Street ran parallel to the East River, lined with warehouses, chandleries, sail lofts, and the offices of ship captains and marine insurers. The buildings here were functional rather than elegant, their facades weathered by salt air and their interiors stacked with barrels, crates, and coils of rope. Men moved constantly between these structures, loading and unloading cargo, negotiating prices, arranging transport to inland markets. The noise was considerable. Hammers struck anvils in blacksmith shops, gulls cried overhead, and the constant creaking of ship rigging provided an underlying rhythm to every transaction. The population was more diverse than the historical record often suggests. Free black New Yorkers numbered several thousand, living primarily in the areas north and east of the commercial center. They worked as laborers, craftsmen, domestic servants, and sailors, occupying an ambiguous position in a society that had only recently abolished slavery within the state. The final abolition would not come until 1827, and in 1805, some enslaved people still lived and worked in the city, their labor essential to the functioning of wealthy households and commercial enterprises. This reality existed alongside the rhetoric of liberty that had animated the recent revolution, a contradiction that most white residents seemed able to ignore. Immigrant communities had begun to establish themselves as well. Irish laborers arrived regularly, seeking work on the docks or in construction. French refugees from the Haitian Revolution had settled in particular neighborhoods, bringing with them the culture and language of the Caribbean. The city's small Jewish population maintained a synagogue on Mill Street, and Dutch families, descendants of the original settlers, still conducted business in their ancestral language. This mixing of peoples created tensions but also opportunities. Languages blended in the marketplace, and cultural practices evolved in ways that would have been impossible in more homogeneous societies. The physical infrastructure was primitive by later standards. There was no reliable system for delivering fresh water to most homes. Residents drew water from public wells and pumps, many of which were contaminated by seepage from privies and animal waste. Yellow fever epidemics struck regularly during the summer months, driving those who could afford it to flee to Greenwich Village or other rural areas north of the city proper. The streets were unpaved except for a few main thoroughfares, turning to mud during rain and creating clouds of dust in dry weather. Pigs roamed freely, serving as the city's primary sanitation system by consuming garbage thrown into the streets. Fire posed a constant threat. Most buildings were constructed of wood, and cooking fires, candles, and heating stoves created countless opportunities for disaster. The volunteer fire companies that responded to alarms were as much social clubs as emergency services, with membership conferring status and political influence. When bells rang out to signal a fire, men rushed from their homes and businesses, not only to save property but to demonstrate their civic commitment and compete with rival companies for glory and reputation. City Hall stood near the intersection of Wall Street and Broad Street, a modest building that housed the municipal government and the mayor's office. The federal government had moved to Washington 5 years earlier, taking with it some of New York's political importance, but the city remained the financial capital of the nation. The Bank of New York, founded by Alexander Hamilton, conducted business from a building on William Street, and the foundations were being laid for what would become Wall Street's dominance of American finance. Men gathered daily at the Tontine Coffee House to trade shares in ships, banks, and insurance companies, creating the informal networks that would eventually crystallize into the New York Stock Exchange. Religious life structured the week for most residents. Churches represented not just spiritual communities but social and economic networks. Trinity Church, the Anglican congregation at the head of Wall Street, owned vast tracts of land throughout Manhattan and wielded enormous influence over city affairs. Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and Catholic congregations served different segments of the population, and membership in a particular church often indicated social class as much as theological preference. Sunday services were mandatory for respectable families, and absence was noticed and remarked upon. The wealthy lived differently from everyone else, though the gap was not yet as vast as it would become in later decades. A prosperous merchant family might employ 3 or 4 servants, own a small library of books, and possess furniture imported from England or France. They ate meat regularly, drank wine with dinner, and could afford to heat multiple rooms during winter. Their children received education from private tutors or attended small academies. But even these families lived without running water, central heating, or any of the technologies that would define comfort in coming centuries. Everyone, regardless of wealth, remained vulnerable to disease, fire, and the other hazards of urban life. The working population rose before dawn and labored until dusk. Artisans worked in small shops attached to their homes, producing shoes, furniture, barrels, and hundreds of other goods essential to daily life. Their apprentices lived with them, learning trades that would support them throughout their lives. Women worked primarily within households, managing domestic tasks that required far more physical labor than their modern equivalents. Washing clothes meant hauling water, heating it over fires, and scrubbing fabric by hand. Cooking required maintaining fires, preparing ingredients from raw materials, and preserving food without refrigeration. Middle-class wives supervised servants in these tasks, while poorer women performed all labor themselves while also contributing to family income through sewing, laundry, or selling goods at market. Entertainment was communal and local. The Park Theater on Park Row offered performances of Shakespeare and contemporary plays, attracting audiences from across the social spectrum, though seating was strictly segregated by class. Taverns served as gathering places where men drank, discussed politics, and conducted business. Public executions drew large crowds, as did military parades and civic celebrations. There were no organized sports in the modern sense, no mass media, no ways to experience culture or entertainment beyond what could be produced locally and witnessed in person. The edges of the city dissolved into countryside with startling abruptness. North of Houston Street, farms predominated, producing vegetables and dairy products for city markets. The roads that led north toward the villages of Greenwich, Chelsea, and Bloomingdale passed through rolling hills and woodland, though speculators had already begun purchasing these lands, anticipating future growth. The commissioner's plan that would impose a grid on Manhattan's landscape was still 6 years away, but the pressures that would necessitate it were already building. Population growth continued steadily, and every year the boundary between urban and rural shifted slightly northward. Looking back across more than 2 centuries, the temptation is to see 1805 New York as quaint or picturesque, but residents experienced their city as thoroughly modern. They lived in the newest buildings of their time, used the most current technologies, and participated in economic and political systems they considered advanced and enlightened. The fact that their city would be unrecognizable within a few generations was not something they could imagine. They built for their present moment, not for our historical curiosity. The sounds of that city are gone now, lost to time. The particular quality of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors announcing their goods, the tolling of church bells marking the hours, the polyglot mix of languages in the market districts, all of this has vanished. We can reconstruct the visual appearance of buildings and streets from paintings, maps, and written descriptions, but the full sensory experience remains inaccessible. We can only approximate it through imagination, layering historical details until something like a living city emerges from the archive. What remains most striking is the scale of human ambition contained within such modest physical circumstances. In 1805, New York was already becoming the place where fortunes could be made, where opportunity drew people from across the Atlantic world, where energy and capital concentrated in ways that would reshape the continent. The seeds of the 20th century metropolis existed in embryonic form, visible to anyone who cared to look carefully at shipping manifests, bank records, and property transfers. History was being made in those narrow streets, though the people making it could not have articulated exactly how. If you could walk those streets now, what would you notice first? What details would capture your attention? I find myself wondering about these questions often, trying to bridge the gap between our world and theirs. Leave your thoughts in the comments below.